next paper by Joan Monras on the regional impact of shocks, migration versus trade.
Thank you for putting this paper into the program. That's joint work with Christoph Albert, who's a postdoc at CEMFI. So let me just jump into the paper. So there's a lot of empirical evidence, or the empirical evidence seems to agree that on the one hand, immigration has negligible effects across local labor markets. One example of this point is this 2019 CART paper. On the other hand, there's also quite some evidence suggesting that import competition has long-lasting effects on employment and wages. And by long-lasting, I mean at least over the 10-year gap horizons that people typically look at when they look at census data. Let me emphasize that this conclusion is reached using almost identical empirical strategies. And in particular, what people typically look is they look at changes in particular outcomes of interest, like wages. And they regress these on an exposure variable. So think exposure at the local level market, either to immigrant workers or imports per worker. Let me emphasize again that the typical way in which these models are estimated uses essentially the same data sets. So US decennial population censuses, virtually the same geography. So sometimes commuting zones, sometimes metropolitan areas, but basically urban commuting zones are indeed metropolitan areas. And they're usually using even very similar time horizons. So usually those regressions are run using data from roughly 1980 to 2010, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later, and they investigate on the same outcomes. And not only that, but also there's a sort of common set of identification assumptions. They're more than that, but the ones I'm gonna focus a little bit more is first, there's a lack of internal migration response. So in both cases, when people have looked at migration responses, when people have looked at exposure to immigrant flows or exposure to trade shocks, many papers argue that we don't see any internal migration response of the natives that are in these different commuting zones. And second, the identification usually relies on similar identification assumptions, mostly these shift share instruments. And in fact, much of the recent literature has really focused on this aspect of in this particular aspect. Okay. Now, in this paper, really what I'm gonna focus, or what we focus on, is this thinking whether it's indeed the case that there's a lack of internal migration response, and to what extent this is driving us, or this may affect some of the results that we get in the literature. To be a little bit more explicit about what we argue, basically, we try to address the question, are import competition and immigration fundamentally different? And we answered this question essentially with two ideas. The first one is that one of the main differences that we observe is that the incidence of where trade and migration is happening is quite different. And in particular, immigrants systematically locate in expensive locations within the US. So think about New York, think about Miami, Los Angeles, etc. Whereas instead, import competition from China is in commuting zones that are not expensive, right? So they're not systematically these big metropolitan areas that we may have in mind. And the second important point that we're gonna make is that we're gonna document empirically that it seems that it's easier to relocate following a negative local income shock when living in an expensive location. And here, what we're gonna point out is basically that when wages change in a particular location, there's they may affect the labor supply in two different ways, substitution and income effect. And the mechanism that we're going to highlight is that if the share of income devoted to housing decreases in income, then it may be the case that larger labor supply responses in high price locations can occur. Okay, I'll illustrate this in quite some detail. Just to preview the main results. So the first idea that I was highlighting in this slide is, well, immigrant shocks and the China shock happen systematically in different places. So within this, and one easy way to see this is if we plot the predicted change in immigrants, and that doesn't matter if we use either the actual immigrant shock or the predicted immigrant shock by one of the IVs that we use against the housing supply elasticity, we see that most immigrants concentrate in housing constrained locations. Okay, what are those locations? Again, those are the New York, Los Angeles, etc. If instead we look at what happens to the China shock, we don't see any systematic relationship between the housing supply elasticity and where is it that these import competition shocks are happening. Okay, now the second bullet point that I had in the previous slide basically says that it's easier to relocate from these locations here than from these locations here, right? And that's a big part of the results that we're going to highlight in this paper. Okay, in particular, what we're going to argue is that metropolitan areas more exposed to immigration or import competition experience little labor market effects and large internal migration responses if their housing markets are constrained. The exact estimates that we get is basically one native relocates for each immigrant worker, or one worker relocates for $1,000 worth per worker's increase in import exposure. And second, there are larger labor market effects and no internal migration response if the metropolitan area or the commuting zone is not constraining their housing supply. Okay, now what the previous slide said is that with immigrant shocks, most of what we see is this part here. With import competition shocks, most of what we see comes from this second bullet point. Okay. In terms of related literature, so we basically speak to at least two types of literatures. I've put this slide relatively brief. First one is about the local incidence of economic shocks. And the second one is about the internal migration responses to local shocks. Let me only highlight in this respect that what we emphasize here is that there's quite substantial heterogeneity in this internal migration response to local shocks, and that's precisely what we're gonna focus on and highlight in this paper, that will provide us a common framework to think both about immigrant shocks or import competition shocks.
May I ask a clarification question?
Sure.
Arash is here. So my question is, do you think, so you put two different literature juxtaposed to each other. You want to tell us that this housing or where they're affecting, which labor markets are affecting, explain the whole difference in the results or part of the difference in the result? Because you can imagine there are many other things that these two shocks are different than each other. Many other reasons that these two shocks are different than each other. Yeah.
Yeah, basically, I'm gonna point out that it's part of the differences, right? And hopefully that will become clearer. So at the end of the talk, I'll present a model to rationalize the findings. So the model is gonna help us think why is it the case that internal migration may be more responsive in housing constrained than in housing unconstrained locations. And that's basically what the point that they're gonna have in common. So for the rest of the talk, basically, I'm gonna first discuss a little bit the identification strategy, or in what ways internal migration affects the identification of immigrant or trade shocks. Then I'm gonna basically introduce a new instrument for immigrant shocks based on some recent work that we've done also with with Christoph. And then basically I'm going to show the results, both looking at immigrant or import competition type of shocks. And finally, if I have enough time, hopefully I'll introduce a model that rationalizes or that helps us think about the heterogeneity in the results that I will present. Okay. All right. So what happens when there's an immigrant-driven labor supply shock and there is in the presence of internal migration responses? So one way to think about it, and this could be an immigrant-driven or an import shock, thinking about inputs that are perfect substitutes or substitutes to native workers. So basically, when there is one way to think about an immigrant-driven labor supply shock is as follows. So think about the local labor market. What happens when some immigrants, denoted by I, locate in that local labor market? Now, why do they locate in this particular labor market? Is perhaps because they value the amenities, the wages, or the price levels in that local labor market. I'll come back to that. But basically what happens if natives are fixed, then the immigrant shock may lower wages following the shape of the local labor demand curve. But at the same time, if there is internal migration, then declines in wages may draw some native workers outside of that local labor market. What this means is that if we have exogenous variation on these immigrant labor supply shocks, basically we're going to be able to identify jointly the effect that this immigrant shock has on wages once internal migration has taken place. Okay, and you'll see in a second why this matters. Or more generally, we can use this simple framework to basically fully understand what is that we're identifying once we have immigrant shocks. So if we have firms that maximize profits in a simple CES type of framework with several factors, then the inverse of the local labor demand curve can be written as follows. So the wages are related to the productivity, the total production, and the amount of workers that we're looking at. So here, for simplicity, I'm just looking at one type of workers, but this can be extended easily to many types of workers. How much wages are going to decline locally with an immigrant shock depends basically on the local labor demand elasticity. We can make this very explicit by assuming that these IC immigrant workers or imported inputs, which look very, very similar, are going to affect the wages in the economy by with this equation. So a change in wages is going to induce changes in wages are going to be related to changes in technology and technological changes in local output produced, changes in internal migration, and the immigrant shock. Okay. Now, when we estimate this type of regressions, basically, if we have exogenous variation, nothing else changes, then we are identifying the local labor demand elasticity. If all the other things or some of the other things change, then what we are identifying is the combination of the local labor demand elasticity plus how the local economy adapts to these immigrant shocks. Okay, to make this even more explicit, in the particular case where technology or local output don't change and internal migration responds to changes in local wages, then we get this simple expression here that basically changes in local wages are going to be, how changes in local wages are going to respond basically depends on two things. First is the local labor demand elasticity, and second, how much internal migration responds to immigrant shocks. Okay. Now, why is it that I'm setting this explicitly? Basically, because exogenous variation in the immigrant shock or in the import competition shock basically allows us to identify these joint parameters. okay? And so in situations, in places where internal migration may be very responsive, so that lambda is close to 1, then we may have very little wage effects, whereas in places where internal migration is not very responsive, so that lambda is close to 0, then the wage effects may be larger. Okay, so go ahead, there's a question.
Can I ask, sorry, I want to come back to my question again. So I think here is the best place to ask it. So okay. I think as you set it up, these two shocks are very similar to each other. And the difference that is appearing is only from the internal migration. But, import shocks are very different than immigration shocks because, if you have an immigrant in your neighborhood, he also consumes goods. So he goes to doctors, and if I'm a native doctor, that has the effect on me. Whereas just bringing Chinese goods in does not have any effect on that, right? So these two phenomena are very different than each other from many different perspectives. And here we are, in a way, we are shying away from those ones, and we are putting only this difference in internal migration, which is nice because going back to my bigger picture question, which was that, so this is one channel that these two are different. And what we will capture is which share of the total difference between card and author literature is through this channel. Am I correct about that, or is I'm?
You're totally correct, and so in the model, basically, so I don't have sort of local consumption in non-tradable so what you would want to have is consumption of local non-tradable goods, but that's exactly what I'm going to have essentially in the model when I introduce the housing market. Okay, and there I'm gonna have a parameter basically that tells you what fraction of the local wages immigrants spend locally, which is gonna potentially capture these some of these effects that you were saying. In terms of comparing this to import competition, this parameter will be either 0, or if you think that there's some storage room that you need for the imports, then you may want to make this parameter positive. So it's going to highlight some of the differences, but the qualitative internal migration response to both shocks is going to be very similar. But yeah, so it's an important point, the one you raised, certainly. All right, so now let me emphasize that crucially we need exogenous variation in this immigrant or import competition shock. And here we innovate a little bit relative to the previous literature in the sense that immigrant location choices likely depend, or like in any standard spatial equilibrium model, on amenities, wages, and the local price index. And in particular, if we go back to, or if we what we argue in a related paper, a related recent paper, is that the indirect utility of immigrants may look something like this, which is basically it may depend on the amenities that as an immigrant, immigrants value across the different locations. So locations are C, indexed by C, and J is the particular country of origin of the immigrant. They may depend on the wages that they receive in that location, and they may depend on the and they depend on the local price index that they face in that country of origin. Okay, why am I putting this forward? Basically, one way to think about instruments is things that change the value of living in a particular location that are independent of labor market outcomes. Okay, in particular, there are two potential instruments. First one is the immigrant networks can be viewed as something that is changing the amenity value of immigrants in certain locations. So why is it that immigrants concentrate in locations where previous immigrants settled? Well, they have these immigrant networks, and they're drawn there because it's easier for them to live in these local labor markets. That's one potential instrument that comes from simple location choice theory of where immigrants decide to live. The second one which comes from the work that we've done with Christoph, comes from exchange rate fluctuations. What we post or what we argue in that paper is that one thing that characterizes immigrants is that part of what they consume it in their countries of origin. And what this means is that they take into account how much the income that they get at destination is going to buy them goods at origin, either because they send remittances or because they plan on returning home. And so basically, fluctuations in the exchange rate are going to be affecting the relevant price index to the different to immigrants in different locations, which can be used as a shifter, as an exogenous shifter in the supply of immigrants across locations. Okay, so in the paper, we're basically going to use both type of instruments. The good thing about having these two different instruments is that we're going to be able to run tests for the validity of the instruments. Okay. So let me introduce a little bit more the details of this new instrument that we propose. So first step is how immigrants react in terms of their location choices as a function of real exchange fluctuations. So what we argue in our previous paper is first is that immigrants concentrate more in low housing elasticity type locations. How do we measure this? We can look at the immigrants at the immigrant share in a particular location relative to the immigrant share in that location, and relate that to the housing supply elasticity in that location. We expect this beta to be negative. If on top of that we introduce heterogeneity by country of origin, and there is some degree of substitutability between consuming where you live and where you come from, then we can use exchange rate fluctuations to basically see if immigrants that come from countries of origin where prices are lower disproportionately locate into low housing supply elasticity type cities. So what do we get in this first step is basically the results that I was anticipating. So immigrants seem to be strongly concentrating in these low housing supply elasticity type cities. That's pulling all immigrants together. If we look at the heterogeneity by country of origin, we see that all immigrants tend to concentrate more in low housing elasticity type cities, but disproportionately so those immigrants that come from low price index countries of origin. That's true both when we compare immigrants from different countries of origin, but also when we use exchange rate fluctuation to identify this parameter, which is what we do in this table. Okay, once we have estimates on the relative immigrant share that we should see for each country of origin across the different local labor markets in the US, basically what we can do is we can take the predictions of this first step, combine it with the aggregate flow of immigrants that we observed during a decade for each country of origin, and normalize it by the relative importance of each location to construct a prediction of the flow of the immigrants from each country of origin into each location within the US. Let me contrast this to the networks instrument. It has a similar structure, except that the location choice part of the immigrant networks instrument is basically related to the size of the immigrant enclave in that location for each country of origin, whereas the location choice part of the new instrument that we propose is basically related or picks up variation in exchange rate fluctuations over the decades, and how this is affecting the relative location of immigrants from the different countries of origin across these different locations. Okay. Now, once we have a prediction on the flow of immigrants from each country of origin, we can add up all the different countries of origin and basically get a predicted change in the total number of immigrants in each metropolitan area. And from these, we can construct the instrument that typically is used, which is this predicted change in immigrants over the decade in each of the different local labor markets relative to the size of the local labor market at the beginning of the period. Okay, so those are that's going to be the identification strategy for the case of immigrants. For the case of the import competition shocks, is going to be basically just following the work by author Dorn and Hansen. In terms of the data, again, very standard. So US Census data, directly the author et al. Data and estimates of the housing supply elasticity that come from size. All right, so let me begin by first showing the first stage of these immigrant shocks. So when we use the networks instrument, we get that networks instrument does a good job at predicting the actual flow of immigrants per capita. When we use our new instrument, we also get a good prediction. And what I think is most interesting, which is going to be important for what comes later, is basically that when we put the two instruments together, our new instrument does a great job at predicting the flow of immigrants across local labor markets within the set of metropolitan areas whose housing supply elasticity is smaller than 1 or between 1 and 2. So those are the housing constrained type locations, whereas in the housing unconstrained locations, basically everything is driven by the immigrant networks, right? What this suggests is that there may be substantial differences between these type of locations and these type of locations, and also the importance in thinking about housing, about the housing market when looking at these questions. Let me summarize what we've done so far. Basically, we propose a new instrument for immigrant shocks based on these exchange rate fluctuations. First important thing is that the new instrument seems better at predicting these immigrant shocks, particularly coming from how it predicts how immigrants are allocated into these housing constrained locations. In the paper, we address some inference issues as well, and basically we show that including geography fixed effects, which in these first different specifications are basically allowing for trends that are different at broader geographic units, limits the concerns on zero correlation. Second econometric or inference issue is basically having two instruments allows us to test for the validity of the instruments, and basically all the results we're going to cluster the standard errors at the state level. Okay. Now, if we compare these instruments to the import competition measures that we have, or that the literature has used, they're very, very similar in the sense that import competition is typically measured as imports per worker at the commuting zone, and the share part or the comes from the exposure to import competition based on the industrial mix. And the shift part comes from the exposure of, or the import penetration in Europe. Okay, but most of the identification comes from the change for the differential industrial mix at the local level. All right, so let me show some of the results. Let me start first by looking at immigration results, and second at import competition results. So what do we see? So let me emphasize, like, basically, as in most of the literature, we also find that immigration seems to have a small effect on wages when we use variation across these different labor markets and specifications that look at the wage change over this 10-year gap horizon. So in particular, if we try to explain the change in wages of the native workers by the relative inflow of immigrants across these different local labor markets, when we run an OLS regression, including year fixed effects and region fixed effects, we get a slightly positive point estimate. Once we instrument this relative inflow of immigrants across the different local labor markets, either with the new instrument that we propose or the networks instrument that the literature has used, basically we get an estimate that it's essentially zero or close to zero. When we use the two instruments, we get the same result, and we cannot reject the hypothesis that the two instruments are valid instruments. Okay, so that's similar to the previous literature. When we look at the change in the employment rate, we get also results that are similar to the previous literature, which is that flows of immigrants seem to be affecting native employment rates, but not very significantly, or not very significantly in terms of magnitude. And again, we get similar results with OLS, with the IV the new IV that we propose, or the networks instrument that we propose. Now, where we get significant, before moving there, in terms of housing prices, which is going to be another part of the model, we basically document that over these 10-year gap horizons, we don't see that the immigration seems to be affecting very significantly housing prices. Again, if anything, immigrants seem to be locating in places that are becoming more expensive, but once we instrument, we essentially get a bunch of zeros. Where we get significantly different results than previous literature, and this is where I'll focus, and that's going to be the focus of the paper, is basically when we look at changes in the amount of natives that we see at the local labor market, which we take as internal migration responses. In particular, when we estimate the effect of migration on changes in the amount of natives at the local level, we obtain a zero when we estimate with OLS, but the moment we instrument, either with our new instrument or the networks instrument, or a combination of the two instruments, we basically get that on average, each immigrant worker leads to one fewer native at the local level. Okay. In the paper, basically, we provide a number of robustness results to that to these. So in particular, we can use a number of different variations of the new instrument that we propose. And pretty much all over the board, and using various types of fixed effects, etc., we get these point estimates that are close to -1. Okay, so quick summary of the findings. Basically, what we find is, like in previous literature, small effects on wages and employment over these 10-year gap horizons. But in contrast to previous literature, we find large effects on internal migration. Okay, and then the question is, I guess, what explains the difference in these internal migration results? And what we argue in the paper, and which is going to be also in line with the results for the import competition, is that it is crucial to think about the heterogeneity of the internal migration response. So let me show this in the last part of the talk. Okay, in particular, previous literature, the regression that is typically estimated is the change in the immigrant, or that is to explain the change in the number of natives at the local level by the immigrant shock instrumented with networks IV, but without using or not always using weights. If we run this regression, basically we get this zero estimate that has been emphasized in previous literature. So it clearly depends on whether we weight each metropolitan area by the number of observations used to compute these the averages at the metropolitan area or not. Just to illustrate this a little bit further, if we break this regression into the three types of metropolitan areas that I was highlighting in the previous paper, we see that there's a strong -1 estimate when we focus on metropolitan areas with housing supply elasticity is below 1, and much less of an internal migration response in metropolitan areas where that don't have so many constraints in local housing markets. And put the two together with this interaction of the immigrant shock and the housing supply elasticity, and we essentially get this this huge heterogeneity between the internal migration response in one type of cities versus another.
So
okay.
Can I just interrupt you 1 second? So it seems that these two instruments really identify different sets of compliers. But then if one thinks about the intuition and the driving variation, I mean, what you said at the beginning is, okay, all immigrants are clustering in very expensive cities like New York, Chicago, etc. This is also where the previous generation of immigrants are located. So perhaps it's not immediate to see that really the compliers are so different. I wonder whether for just illustrative purposes, you might show a map actually of the predictions of the two instruments, or a sort of a ranking of metropolitan areas most affected by either instrument.
So that's a good suggestion. But you said something that it's crucial here, right? So the new instrument that we propose basically makes the IV put weight into these housing constrained locations. The immigrants IV, without having our newly proposed immigrant, put weight both on these housing constrained locations plus some others. Most of these metropolitan areas are close to the Mexican-US border. Okay, so that's basically what the two IVs are doing. You'll see this. So we don't have a map, but you'll see, or you can see this in the graphs like the one I showed in the introduction, which I'll show again in a second. All right, so that's taking into account this heterogeneity is crucial. Okay, so that's what we get for immigration. And I guess the next question we address is whether or how do these results compare to import competition from China? Whether indeed we also obtain this heterogeneous internal migration response, which may explain part of the reason why labor market effects are more persistent in those locations. Okay. So what do we get here? So first column, and it's going to be the same in the following tables that I'm going to show. First table is the exact estimate coming from the Autor, Dorn, and Hansen paper. Second column is the same regression, but concentrating on metropolitan areas for which we can identify the housing supply elasticity. And the third column basically looks at the heterogeneity between metropolitan areas with constrained housing markets and unconstrained ones. Okay, so what does this table show us is basically that essentially all the negative impact on wages that we observe in or that was estimated in the Autor, Dorn, and Hansen paper come from essentially the metropolitan areas that are not constrained in their housing markets. So remember, those are the metropolitan areas where population is going to be more sticky. That's something that we see when we look at the effect on wage changes, but similar picture emerges when we look at the change in the share of people not in the labor force. That's the measure that they use in their paper. So that's why I use here instead of the employment rate. Same estimate as the one they get, similar estimate when we drop the rural commuting zones, big heterogeneity between housing constrained and housing unconstrained locations. And final table using import competition shocks. Again, what we see is that there's this huge heterogeneity in the internal migration response. So there are not that many metropolitan areas with housing constrained markets, but from those markets, there seems to be a large internal migration response, whereas for those metropolitan areas with unconstrained housing markets, the effect of import competition on change in population is essentially zero, which is the estimate that the Autor, Dorn, and Hansen suggest. Okay, so most of what they argue that their identification strategy is valid based on this point estimate, which is close to 0. We see that this is highlighting this massive heterogeneity. People seem to be responding very strongly in housing constrained location. People seem to be unreactive to import competition shocks in housing unconstrained locations. And that's coming mostly from the young workers, which are the ones who are typically assumed to be more mobile.
But at the same, those workers are probably less likely to be homeowners. So this impact of like the housing wealth that makes you rich in a sort of highly constrained location is not that strong for the people that are most likely to move.
Yeah, so that goes. So that goes to the part where we're still working on. So whether what's generating this differential internal migration is housing wealth. So we haven't checked. So we haven't checked a lot of heterogeneity in terms of homeowners versus renters. But what we've checked, we don't see major differences between the two, particularly with immigration shocks. Now, the part that we're thinking is whether these results are explained by the fact that if you're affected by a negative shock in New York, you sell your house and you're rich elsewhere, right? That would be one story, or the more nuanced story on how expenditure on housing affects your internal migration mobility. The two are quite related. We're still not 100% clear on the two, but that's essentially what we're trying to think through in the model. All right, so how are we trying to, or let me just highlight what's the main difference. Let me do two things. Let me first highlight what's the main difference between immigration and import competition that we observe. And then let me give you the key intuition that we are putting forward in the model. The main difference between import competition, between immigrant shocks and import competition shocks is really where they happen, right? So if we plot the actual change in immigrants during the 90s, so from 1990 to 2000, we see that most immigrants concentrate in these large and expensive locations, plus a few immigrants that move into these smaller locations close to the Mexican-US border. What our instrument does is basically put weight into these locations, right? What the networks instrument would show up is something that looks like this, but with a few extra dots here and there. If we contrast that to the China shock, basically we see that there's no systematic relationship between the housing supply elasticity and the predicted China shock, or the actual China shock, right? And so not taking into account the heterogeneity in the potential labor market consequences and internal migration responses to the two types of shocks explains a big chunk of the difference between the seemingly opposing results that we get from these two literatures. And just to finish in the last minute, so let me highlight the basics in the model. So first, it's not obvious why internal migration would be more responsive in places where price houses, the housing prices respond less. So that's the first thing that we provide, or that we argue with the model. And second is we provide a framework to think about what could generate this internal migration response. So let me just go directly into that slide and then conclude. So basically, and here you'll see hopefully the difference of where we're going. So if we look at the effect of a wage change, ignoring the house price effect, so starting from the simple labor supply model, where the amount of natives in a location depends on real wages, we can take the derivative of this with respect to wages, and basically we're going to have that if we ignore house price effects, population is more responsive to high price locations, provided that the share devoted to housing is decreasing in income. Okay, so that's basically what seems to be happening in the data. The alternative, which is what very often has been studied in the previous literature is what's the effect of a wage change ignoring these income effects. So assuming that the share of income devoted to housing is a constant fraction, then basically we get the standard result that population should be more responsive in housing unconstrained locations than in housing constrained locations. Okay. Now, what we do in the paper is basically bringing these two together into a general equilibrium, spatial equilibrium model, where we do take into account the potential local consumption of immigrants or import competition for that matter. I don't have much more time left.
We should probably stop here. Sorry. If there is like space for a very quick question, please go ahead if anybody has a question. Otherwise, probably we should skip the conclusion slide.
No problem.
Yeah, sorry, Joan. Can you hear me? Hi, how are you? So good. I just want to ask a very quick question about the potential interaction between those two instrument variables. So because eventually, even you are thinking about like the immigrants and the local people in one metropolitan area, they have a tendency to constrain in like sub-locations by themselves, right? So essentially, like the specific area those immigrants will go to will be the area where you already have a lot of the people like similar to you. And this, in that case, the housing price will be a little bit different from maybe even in the next block, but belongs to a different community concentrated with those local people. So in some sense, like those two instrument variables could be have a very deep interactions. So like when you are trying to say the heterogeneities among the area with different housing elasticity, are you also able to check the heterogeneity for the area with a different instrument variable? I mean the network instrument variable. Check about the heterogeneity in that dimension.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm going to have a lot of time to answer this question. Basically, so you're asking about heterogeneity within metropolitan areas. So that's something that we can incorporate into the model by thinking within city structure, but I'll leave the answer here because I think we're pretty late already.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Joan.